to a new episode of In the Company of Stars. It's been a couple weeks since we've had an episode, and I thank you so much for your patience. We've been working on a few projects which I hope you'll enjoy, but I'll tell you more about that at the end of the show, so stay tuned. Hopefully you'll agree with me that today's guest was worth the wait. We'll be talking about fairy witchcraft and ceremonial magic, scrying, the Holy Guardian Angel, the OTO, and diverse voices in magic, with my fellow swordsperson, Harper Feist. We had a couple little audio issues at the beginning, but they are only on the first 2 points where Harper speaks. Aside from that, it's all clear, so just bear with us in that first minute or so. I hope you enjoy the show. Well, hello, Harper, and welcome to In the Company of Stars. I'm so glad that you're here today, and I think that our listeners are really going to enjoy getting to listen to us talk about some things here. So I'm super excited to get started.
Thanks for the invitation, BJ. I'm really glad to be here.
So we usually start off with 3 questions that kind of look at how things maybe started for you, how they became meaningful for you, and how they got you where you are. So let's start with those. Basically, when I kind of look at things with people, I tend to think that most people have some experience that comes up that shows them that there's something to magic or spirituality or religion. And I just wondered, what was a moment like that for you? Something that was kind of a major, important moment that showed you that there was something out there?
I had to think kind of hard about this question. I don't relate to it because as far back as I remember, spirituality has been really important to me. I was born and raised Lutheran, and so of course, when I was a small person, my deity was the old man on the cloud kind of thing, like Super Santa Claus, I suppose. And I related to that until I got to be a teenager, and then I suppose I went into a little bit of apostasy at that time. I think that's not unusual for a teenager.
Yeah.
But in any case, my first year in college, I attended a Take Back the Night event. It's anti-rape, anti-harassment sort of event. And I was involved with a very large group ritual of women who were talking about a female deity. And the ritual was, I think, sort of a boring affair, but the notion that my personal relationship with the larger universe could go through a feminine agency was really stunning to me. And I think if there was anything that sort of kicked off the path to where I am now, it would have been those moments.
Okay, I kind of relate a little bit in that growing up, I was always very spiritual, very religious person, and never kind of had a point where that wasn't the case. And so I guess it's a little odd that I ask a question like that, but I had trouble answering it myself. And so you went to this event, you discovered the possibility of relating to the universe through a divine feminine figure. How did that kind of shape your work at the time? How did that shape how you got into things from there?
Well, I suppose that was a long time ago, really. And what was available at the time was some interesting books at the feminist lesbian bookstore in Denver. You couldn't actually find this stuff anywhere else. And so I acquainted myself with the works of Starhawk and her friends. At the same time, a person I know gave me a copy of the Thoth deck, and I started to look for the OTO. And of course, being a long time ago, there was no OTO presence in Denver. So I kind of gave that up, and that reappears several times through sort of my my magical history. But at that time, I looked for the OTO, couldn't find it. Starhawk really wasn't present in Denver. So I read for a long time and stayed away from my parents' Lutheran church, I guess.
I think a lot of people have that sort of reading period before they start getting involved with other people. I know I definitely had that, probably partially from starting as a kid, but even once I got old enough to go out to groups with other people, I was always very limited on that.
Hmm.
So, how does the work that you kind of started at that time, from the things you were reading and I assume experimenting with, how does that play into where you are now, or did that help impact getting you to where you are now?
Oh, I suppose it's unavoidable that it impacted who I am now. I would suppose that I gave myself permission in those early days to be exploratory and syncretic. So I kind of read everything I could get my hands on, and I talked with lots of people, fluffy and not, and just uh, explored. And I still do that.
I think exploring is the way to go. I mean, there's so much stuff that's out there that without exploring, you'll never find what really fits. So now you're a person who's somewhat well known in the ceremonial magic community and in the OTO. But prior to that, I understand you were involved in Anderson Feri, and you mentioned Starhawk, and so reclaiming witchcraft. Um, it surprises me sometimes that people don't know much about Anderson Feri, and um, that people assume that reclaiming is from the same sort of background as Wicca is. Could you tell us a little bit about how you got involved with those, or what the experience was like? If there were any major elements that kind of stood out or spoke to you in those systems?
Well, I suppose I got involved in them originally because they were available where I was living at the time. There were reclaiming people who have called themselves reclaiming witches present when I was living in Massachusetts, and that's where I sort of fell in with the reclaiming and the fairy communities. So it was the presence of people there who were actually doing ritual and performing workings and kind of spinning up community that got me involved. And I would say that um, fairy and reclaiming are related, but they're a little different. Reclaiming is a very California-esque sort of thing, even now, in that it's based in a kind of spiritual uh, way of looking at feminism and political activism. So there's a real mundane component to reclaiming that maybe isn't present so much in the CM community, at least, and probably in the OTO as well. Uh, from Fairy, I learned that sensuality is a really important part of my magical path, and I would say that I continue to use that every day.
Okay. So you continue using the element of learning about sensuality from Anderson Feri. Are there still activities from these groups otherwise that you use in your personal work?
I wouldn't say explicitly, although my relationship with my holy guardian angel is sort of all about what I learned in Fairy. Really, I think we'll probably talk more about that in a minute. And then all of the sort of technology around chanting and around trance is a thing that I was introduced to by both fairy practitioners and reclaiming, and that you will see in rituals that I have created, certainly.
So have you ever explored any other sorts of witchcraft or been drawn to trying other types of witchcraft? And if so, what about those other systems drew you in that was different or separate from what drew you into Anderson Feri or into ceremonial magic?
Well, clearly there's CM, but I think you're going to ask me more about that. I would say that I'm kind of fascinated with root work, but I don't know much about it. When people start talking about it, I pay attention and look for ways I can utilize it, but I know not so much about that.
And I've often noted that people who come into ceremonial magic directly frequently miss a lot of the visceral feeling of energy movement and occult sensation, which is so much the focus of neo-pagan magic. As I understand it, ecstasy, trance, and dynamic energetics are a major part of Anderson Feri. How do you feel those experiences with that kind of magic have benefited you as a ceremonial magician? And would you recommend that to ceremonial magicians who don't have that kind of experience in their backgrounds?
Um, I would say that the major benefit of having studied Feri before CM would be that I've developed a deep trust of my body as a spiritual tool. And I think to kind of compare that with the ordinary sort of scrying conjure model of CM that most people use, I think the goal for most scryers is to have a visual experience. And I think, and we'll probably talk about this more later, but I think that you're really shortchanging yourself if you don't use the rest of your god or goddess given senses to scry with, or to conjure with, or for that matter to make cheesecake with. It's just all of these things that we do in magic are given to us by virtue of our humanity and our incarnated state. Whether or not other CM practitioners should dive into Feri, that's a question probably worthy of a beverage. I think Feri would make a fair number of our colleagues a little uncomfortable.
After I was involved in the OTO, but before I was an OTO member, I was in a ceremonial magic group that was run primarily by Orthodox Jewish people who had left the Golden Dawn. And they were trying to create sort of a Golden Dawn system, but drawing more on traditional sources. And as they were developing and growing that, they found that there was a need for something more basic, more energy, more bodily oriented. And so, with their local chapter of the organization, they also started a group that was working with Anderson Feri techniques for more beginner people coming in and developing that way before transitioning into what they were doing.
So it must have been successful.
Yeah, I think they actually got a lot more attention for their kind of fairy group, and I think that more of what they were doing with that ended up leading to where they went ultimately with what they were doing. I ended up not continuing with the group, and I think it kind of changed and shifted to more of a local thing. From what I heard later on, it sounded like a lot of what they were doing with those energy work practices and with a lot of the fairy stuff ended up being a big impact on what they ultimately became.
I could see that.
So you do a lot of work as a scryer. Do you feel that your work with Fairy helped you prepare for this? And what did it add to your capabilities as a scryer?
That's an impossible question to ask. It's impossible for the simple fact that I was a Feri practitioner before I was a formal scryer. So I have no idea what the experiment would have been like had I never indulged with the Feri practices. I'm guessing, based on what I said before, and also based on your recollection, that it is very helpful. If you kind of dig down into scrying and what it is sort of fundamentally, it's listening. And if you're able to listen with your body, that's just more information, more signal.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And like I said, I think that a lot of people kind of come into things without having that active listening, without having that awareness and sensation and knowing how to listen to those sensations. So anything that's going to teach you to do that, especially in a very bodily manner, in a very energetic manner, probably would help.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say is different for you in working as a scryer versus working as a conjurer? Do you enjoy doing both? Or are there different ways that you feel people need to prepare for each job or for each experience? And how does each role change your experience of working with spirits?
Oh, no, that's too many questions at once.
we
No.
can scale back. We can start with just what's the difference for you? Like, do you enjoy doing both? Is there kind of a different mindset that you go into with each one?
Oh, of course, they're um, very different exercises. I enjoy doing both. I would say, in a super simplified sort of plane, you're talking about a projective versus a receptive role. The conjurer, she listens to be certain, but her primary role is to address the entity being summoned. The scryer's chief role is an active receptive role and not a passive one. We can beat that with a baseball bat if you want to, but she listens. So there's a drawing in, and then there's a, a feeling of the thing. And I would say there you asked about the different ways people need to prepare for each of these experiences. I think there are commonalities there, and I'm not going to address what other people do. We each have our own technique to prepare for a working. The preparation I use before a conjure event is almost the same as for taking the scrying role. Although in our house, the conjurer sets up the altar space, so that's different.
Is that something that you think just kind of organically arose behind how you work, or do you think there's something that helps with having the conjurer be the one that's setting up that space?
I think both, actually. So the conjurer sets up the space, and she actually, or he, is in preparation to make the contact, and all the technology is there. So there's the ritual tools, there are holy water, incense, candles, whatever. All of those tools, they help the conjurer do their work. And I think in our house, it happened that way because the scryer ordinarily takes a ritual bath. Taking a ritual bath is incompatible with setting up the temple. So it's just, there's an order of operations there that I think has developed over time.
Makes sense. Makes sense. And I think I know local practice back when the OTO lodge here didn't have a permanent setup and permanent space was that the deacon was the one who was in charge of building the temple, and there'd be a team doing it, but the deacon was the one that led the team, and ultimately everything fell on the deacon as far as who was responsible for making sure it was done.
Mm-hmm.
Part of the view that a lot of us had was the deacon was coming in as the operant magician who was going to be calling forth the different forces and beings involved in the rite, and so the deacon had to build the space for that and kind of create the space. And it sounds like you have kind of a similar approach.
I'm certain we could do the whole tree of life analysis on why the deacon is the boss, but it's similar. Yep.
So would you be comfortable talking a little bit about how your preparations work for scrying?
Oh, sure, I can talk about that because they're in flux right now. So historically, I would attempt to reach kind of a clean, empty space where I could invite the presence of an entity into or near me, basically. I have really, really terrible eyesight. And maybe this is why my scrying is principally physical. And so it's not a possession, but I feel the spirit in my body. And the ritual bath is an important part of that. So I sit in the bathtub, I make it real hot, I sit in it until it's cold, and I sing the Lutheran Te Deum, an old one. And that's probably a character flaw, don't judge me, but it works to create a sort of a clean canvas for when I'm finished with my bath. I will put a white bar towel on my head, and always a new one, a clean one, and I will go into the temple that the conjurer has, Rufus has set up, and we'll do the working.
That sounds like a very comfortable sort of setup procedure. I like that.
It feels good, and the sense in which my preparations are in flux right now has to do with some experimentation that we've been up to with some information we've derived from the PGM. That's all new stuff. Maybe I won't talk too much about that because it's not fully battle tested, as it were.
I'll definitely be curious to hear about it once it is. So, as a person with a lot of experience in scrying, do you feel that some people are more cut out for scrying versus conjuring? Or what do you feel are some characteristics which someone might benefit from in either of those respective roles?
Oh, I'm not sure if that's a fair question. So I'll say why I think that. I haven't spoken with a whole lot of other people who do scrying for other conjurers. One of my old friends in Colorado Springs is one of those people, High Strider, and he works with Frater Asan Chasan, basically. And I think he is a person that's a little bit like me in that, present circumstances notwithstanding, I don't talk very much. I'm a listener. So I think, I would, statistics n equals 2. To be a scryer, you should have a listening practice. You should practice listening to real live people first, and then you should practice listening to your invisible friends. You should also listen to plants and animals. That's just me. And people who can listen to anything. People who can talk, well, they do that. And I'm not going to get into that because I don't know very many people who spend a lot of time doing this conjure work, and I can't classify their personality characteristics. I think there's a pretty wide variety of people in each of those. And we all develop our own techniques anyway. So as nice as the question is, maybe it's not so important.
I think that's fair, and I think that your answer still gives a lot of insight that'll be really useful for people. I know Rufus got started with grimoire conjuration using art of drawing spirits into crystals, and then went on to popularize it as a starting method for people exploring spirit conjuration. Was this also the text that got you started, or had you worked with some other grimoire previously?
Well, to be very specific, I had worked with one other grimoire before I started working with Josh. I had worked with a friend of mine who lived outside of Boulder, Colorado, and we used the Goetia of Dr. Rudd, the Skinner and Rankin version. And I found it to be remarkably effective. We made all the tools, we deployed all the tools in a Masonic temple, we locked the door, and then we did the rite. The rite was truly successful in a way that surprised me to my core and kind of hooked me into all of this magical work that I've done since, really.
So your first grimoire rite was full tool version of the Goetia.
Yes.
That's pretty impressive. I imagine there's not a lot of people who can say that they jumped in that way. That's pretty cool.
Well, the funny thing is that the person who invited me to scry for him at that ritual, let's call it a ritual, I think, he's not here to ask. It's probably not kind of me to say this, but I think he wanted another person there because he was afraid it would work.
I think that's fair and understandable. I know some of the people who helped teach me some basic stuff, I'll say around grimoire magic, because it was in the 90s before there was a lot of material for anyone to be going on. One of the ideas that they presented with working with the Goetia and the infernal spirits was the idea that fear can be a significant factor in creating the space that's needed in order to be able to conjure them, and that going out to kind of empty or abandoned spaces or out to graveyards or out in the middle of the night was part of how we created the mental space that allowed for that interaction. So I can see where where if he did have some of that fear, that could have been something that may have been useful in creating a successful experience. Did you have the same sort of fear, do you think, when you went into it, or were you expecting anything that you were fearful of, if you can remember?
Well, I was nervous about it in the same way that I'm nervous about talking to you, actually. So this is a new experience for me, and I, of course, actually the analogy is a good one, so let's stick with it. When I agreed to do this interview with you, BJ, I was afraid I would fail, and I was afraid that I would look silly, and I basically had those same concerns as in my first scrying event. I had no idea what to expect. I hadn't even read the whole damn book. Shame on me.
I think that's fair to go in kind of not knowing what to expect. I think it's pretty awesome that you were able to just jump in even with not knowing what to expect and not knowing if you were ready. I think that's a quality that a lot more magicians could benefit from. And for the record, I think you're doing a great job so far today. So,
well, thank you.
you said that it was a really very clearly successful experience. Do you feel comfortable talking a little bit more about that, of what made it a success, or what you recall the experience being like?
Well, sure. We had the circle, the 9-foot circle that we had painted in my living room on a giant piece of canvas. We had a smaller triangle that we had constructed out of wood off to the side. It was pretty far away. This is a really big room. And when the spirit, and I'm not going to talk about who the spirit was. Let's leave that for now. But we used the summoning ritual from the book, and immediately there was a cold sensation from some chairs that were some distance away from the triangle. And then there was a humanoid thing in one of the chairs. Now, my partner in crime did not see he didn't see the spirit. I could see the spirit, I could smell the spirit, I could feel temperature change sensations that were strange and uncomfortable. And I should say, the spirit didn't show up in the right place, which was really unnerving. And when I told my friend that, there was a terrible moment for him when basically I think he wanted to run away. But what the spirit projected to us was something along the lines of the stereotypical Jewish mother. It's like, why doesn't anyone ever call me? And there was the sensation of feeling rejected, kind of. So we talked to the spirit for a while, and then we let him go in the prescribed manner, and then I never saw my friend again.
Wow.
So that actually is an interesting part of the story. So we did all this work, and we rushed because I was being relocated to Florida from Denver, and we did the working either the day before or 2 days before I actually left the state. And I haven't been back except to visit since. I have not seen this guy since, but he did call me after I'd lived in Florida for a couple of weeks, and he said, I was having a massage, and all of a sudden, our invisible friend showed up. Unsummoned, whatever, and I will confess, I got really nervous, and I took the seal of invisible friend, and I dumped out my metal toolbox. It was orange, and I put the seal in an orange metal toolbox. And because I'd had kind of a good experience with the spirit, I covered the orange toolbox with roses. And then I got on Facebook and I started to talk to people about, okay, we called this guy up and he's like hanging around. And now I have him in an orange toolbox, by the way. And that's actually how I met Josh.
Yeah, that's a pretty interesting story. I didn't know that element of the background there. I mean, that's definitely an impressive way to jump into all of that. With jumping in so intensely into a grimoire experience, how did you sort of make that jump from working in a witchcraft context to working in a grimoire context? Like, what led you to explore that?
Well, I want to say it was partly my early days with the OTO. Along this time, I discovered there was an OTO presence in Denver, which is really funny because, when I was looking for the OTO as a kid, I grew up in Colorado. So I was looking for the OTO as a kid, nothing. So I go off, I get all my schooling, I go to grad school, I move to Massachusetts, I moved to New Hampshire, then I moved back to Colorado, and voila, there's the OTO is finally in Denver. So I went to a Gnostic Mass, was sort of blown away. I bet lots of people have this stunning first experience of priestess and goddess and how everything works together in the Gnostic Mass. And I started kind of rethinking how I did things at that point, and just in the milieu of people I met as a result of hanging out with the OTO, I met this man who wanted to do the goetic working. So I'm a scientist for my day job, and I'm like this all the time. If I want to do a laboratory working that's a little iffy, I'll do that too, really. That's just me.
And I think that makes sense for reaching any level of success in magic, like a willingness to experiment. If you're just doing the same thing over and over again, you're not going to be able to find what's out there and what works.
Oh, exactly. If you don't change your situation, it's not going to change.
You mentioned that the sort of follow-up to this conjuration experience, kind of figuring out what to do from there, was part of how you and Rufus met. How did the conjuration partnership there develop, and after that first conjuration, what did your early conjuration work look like?
Well, the early stuff was all done with the modified Trithemius route that he's so well known for. We conjured angels, we conjured intelligences of the planets, we did experiments together, and we are still doing experiments together. In general, the conjuration that he wrote for Seven Spheres, it's easy, it's brief. We've added a piece where the scryer is blessed that helps the scryer into a trance that's really effective. So we're still largely using that, I would say.
The idea of blessing the scryer is kind of interesting to me. That's something I've been experimenting with a little bit, and did some work with that in a ritual at Blake a couple years ago. And that ritual has actually informed the book that I'm releasing now, where there's this whole element of sort of magically augmenting the scrying experience.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something that, as more people experiment with that kind of thing, that'll be a big thing for people's ability to explore and interact with spirits.
I think the Frater Asan Chasan and Strider, they have a whole section of their conjuration devoted to the preparation of the scryer, and I think it's hypnotic. So there are other folks out there who are playing around with that technology, and I think, anything that can help the scryers sort of linear thought processes to slow down or be quieted, any of that technology is super important. Very useful.
Definitely. I know at this point, like you said, you've experimented a lot. And so you've worked with a handful of different sorts of grimoire spirits, and I assume also different grimoires and conjuration methods. What would you say is your favorite one, and why is that one your favorite?
I don't think I have a favorite. I'm very fond of the conjuration that Josh has come up with simply out of familiarity. I think there are some, I wouldn't call them conjuration script, but abilities to command the spirits from PGM. Super interesting. Anything with the headless right in it.
Yeah.
Super effective. I mean, anything from the PGM version of it to Samic, right? That's a great way to turn on the hose. I think in preparation for this interview, it occurred to me that I'd like to actually go back to Dr. Rudd and see what it's like after all these years, and go back to the beginning, see what happens.
Well, if you do end up doing that, that's another thing I'd love to hear about at some point. But I think that would be exciting to kind of see from the the beginning up to now after all this additional time and experience, what the changes are. Now, with different types of methods or with particular spirits, do you feel that there's different kinds of results and experiences that go with either using a different method or with interacting with different sorts of spirits?
That's a good question, but I think I'm going to disappoint you a little bit in my experience. So for me, talking to spirits when you do it on purpose, like, okay, you pick up the phone and you call your anti-mame, there's a similarity there. So when you talk to any spirit, they give you some information about themselves. They help you do what you ask them to do. Hey, Auntie Mame, can you make me a cherry pie? Sure thing, Harper. Of course. Can you help me find these last items? Sure. Is that woman pregnant? Uh-huh. So that kind of stuff. All that's really predictable. And so when you ask about different sorts of experiences and results, all of that is pretty predictable. It happens the way the grimoires tell you it will. And it is in large part like talking to a person. Now, things get weird when spirits show up and you haven't summoned them. So that happens occasionally to all of us, I think, and things get weird there. Like that's can be unsettling. It can be it can feel like huge honor. It can also be really terrifying. So when things come unsummoned, that gets interesting.
Do you have any experiences with that you'd be comfortable talking about?
Well, I don't recall the details super well, but I documented it in my blog. But there was a time when Josh had a working to do for a client, and I got home from work. This is in Florida, so heavy lab work or range work, I can't remember. But I came home from work. It was I was a piece of toast. I was so tired. So I said, all right, I'm going to go to bed. You go talk to the invisible friends and find out what's the haps. So he went into the temple. At that point, we had a whole room devoted to the thing, which we don't anymore. But so he went into the temple and began his work, and I went into the bathroom to take my contact lenses off, and my eyes started burning. They burned, and then they started to tear up, and before you know it, I was like Niagara Falls in the bathroom. And it occurred to me that I needed not to go to bed, but to go into the temple instead. And I was invited in, basically, and I scried the rest of the working.
That's pretty interesting. So when you got in, did it change how the experience you were having with your eyes?
Oh, they dried right up. I mean, I was instantly okay. I'm happy you asked that. I forgot that part of the story. I arrived in before the altar, and I was where I needed to be. It was a little uncomfortable.
I can see where that would be, but I think also those are some of the really interesting experiences in magic, when the spirits sort of make it very clear what needs to happen in a ritual as it's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. When you're told to do something, that's when things get cool.
I guess not fully away from the subject of scrying or conjuration, but in the Bradepti Across America chat that you and Jason and Josh and some other people and I had recently, you brought up a really interesting topic of spiritual purity. And we discussed what it is, how it works, and how contexts not used to thinking in that manner approach it. You seemed very reflective on the idea, but largely held back from your own views on it. And that left me sort of wondering, how do you approach the idea of ritual purity as a scryer? How does it impact your scrying?
I think this is a functional question rather than a philosophical one, although there's a place for philosophy and discussion of purity in general. I would say that ritual purity, as as a magical worker is proper preparation for a working. So we talked about my predilection for hanging out in the tub and singing pieces from the old red Lutheran hymnal. I think when I'm talking about ritual purity, I'm just talking about how to get into a deep listening place that's effective to do the work. There's a whole history behind this, right, about what ritual purity is. And ritual purity is a function of what the context is for the ritual. So if you have a ritual that's based in Christianity, then there's going to be a sexual component to that where, no touchy for a little while. 3 days is sort of a favorite of people, I suppose. Not imbibing in intoxicants is important to a whole variety of religious backgrounds. Eating meat also of interest when establishing purity. All of that sort of begs the question of why do all that stuff? And anything we do in preparation for a magical working, or anything else for that matter, has got to, strip it down. What's the reason? And the reason is to get yourself into a place where what you're doing will be effective, I think.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a way that people can approach it without regard to any particular religious background or philosophy, just sort of doing what's mechanically needed in order to make it work.
Another thing about that is the farther you go to put yourself in that effective place, and so for people in the conjuring community, we're all familiar with all the gear that you're supposed to have. So there's the circle, there's the triangle, there's the lion skin belt, there's a lamen, all that stuff. There's a purpose for all that stuff, and it's to put you in a space where you will be effective in your working. Some people don't need all that stuff, but if you want to pull out all the stops, and you feel like you've pulled out all the stops, that does a thing to your head that will make you more effective. And I think, from a purity standpoint, if you've gone without an impure thought, without eating meat, and without a glass of wine for 3 days, and you're used to doing all those things, what you've done there is created a situation where you're going to do something special. And then you exert your attention in a better way.
And that's a really good way to describe it. Well, again, along the lines of the idea of ritual purity and how it works in modern contexts, the EGC doesn't really have instructions for that in its system. And that was, again, one of the things that came up when we were talking about it before. As a priestess in the EGC, how do you approach preparing for EGC rites? And do you feel that there's a corollary with the sort of ritual purity or preparation idea that is approached in the grimoires, or do you feel like it's something else that's going on with the preparation there?
It's an awesome question. So I think that whether or not you're actually educated in ritual purity with respect to the EGC probably depends a whole lot on who your bishop is. I do know that there are bishops out there that have very specific recommendations about how to prepare for the performance of the Gnostic Mass, and those include a period of meditation and ritual bathing and that sort of thing. I guess when I was thinking about how to get set up for the Gnostic Mass, I started reading Crowley, and Crowley has an essay on chastity, which is an interesting thing. Clearly, Crowley wasn't going to give up sex for more than 5 minutes to do anything, so that's not what chastity is for Crowley. And I'm just being silly there, but what Crowley says is that chastity is the state of being uncontaminated. So for Crowley, ritual purity is being yourself and only yourself and presenting that self to the gods. So there's no, don't drink that absinthe. No, there's nothing of the sort in Crowley's writing. As a scientist, right, I'm all about measuring contaminants and reducing contaminants and understanding impurities in processes and all this kind of stuff, and to be yourself and uniquely yourself and present that to any invisible friends, I think is part of recipe for success.
I think that's very true. I think that makes a lot of sense. And initially, I was going to ask about sort of how you feel about the need for some sort of analog for ritual purity in the context of something like the EGC, but the way you describe that there, I mean, it sounds like it's basically already there. People just need to kind of actualize and look at it and really be aware of it.
Well, and probably also be really tied into the sorts of activities that lead them to the right mental place to perform the mass.
Mhm.
I mean, I guess I think it's a true statement that I've never actually taken a ritual bath before I have performed the Gnostic Mass. I have, on the other hand, made cakes of light by myself in the kitchen with no clothes on. I mean, so that is an invocation of goddess force to focus my energies before the Mass. So to me, that it sounds different, but it performs the same use as a ritual bath before I scry in a grimoire situation, but it has a different flavor to it because the Gnostic Mass, it's a different religious experience.
That makes sense, and it's definitely better than my usual preparation of doing a business meeting before celebrating Mass.
Okay, been there too. And we all have limited time, and we do what we can for sure.
But I like the idea of that, of kind of doing the work to get into the space for it and to prepare yourself. Like, one of the things that I always did was to read the Mass and sort of recite it to myself before going up to say the Mass. And so usually you could see me sitting in some corner of the temple with the Mass script and sort of halfway looking at the script, mostly not looking at the script, and just sort of very quickly running through like the whole Mass in about like a 10-minute period as like a mental preparation.
Mm-hmm.
So, which after time, way less to do with any sort of memorization element, and it was really just a matter of like getting that focus, getting that preparation, basically doing the meditation element that you talked about.
All right, makes total sense.
One of the things that comes up for me frequently is that, of course, historically for conjuration, there was a tie to priesthood, and ceremonies of conjuration are based on ceremonies of exorcism and other liturgical rituals to some degree. Do you feel that there's a clerical empowerment that comes into play from working with the EGC or from working with the clerical and ritual actions of the EGC that can create some benefit in a broader magical practice or in a conjuration practice?
Oh, of course, of course. The moment I was ordained a priestess, I felt spiritual authority in an important way. But, flip that on its head, historically speaking, the scryer was supposed to be a 12-year-old child. 12-year-old child has very little spiritual authority. And I want to say that the purpose of having an innocent as a scryer is just to have that absolutely blank canvas. To be ordained clergy with all the spiritual authority that's conferred in that action, that's very different. But I also think it was an effective boost in my ability to do magical workings in general.
I think a lot of people find that to be the case, that there's something about the sort of apostolic transmission of power there, and the probably an element of focus that those rites give when they create direction, which is of course what ordination means, that leads to a difference in how we're able to approach magic. It's a really interesting observation that it is sort of the opposite of what the advised state for a scryer would have been in a lot of the texts. As an OTO body master, there was a certain responsibility to ensure the correct performance of OTO traditions like the Mass and its appendant sacraments, initiations, and the curricula of thelemic rituals. But there's also a need to create new and interesting events that serve the needs and interests of the community. You were a body master in a city with rich historical tie to modern magic. How do you feel that that afforded you options to create interesting and informative events and experiences? And what were maybe some of the coolest things that you encountered as a body master?
Well, I think, in answering that question, Minneapolis is called Paganistan by many people. And the alternative religions are really common here. I've never lived in a place where there were so many self-avowed tree huggers ever. And I've lived all over the place. So I would say that during my tenure as body master, and I have recently stepped down, as you know, I was really interested in reaching out to the pagan community. My immediate predecessor was really interested. I think her goal was to create a really safe and stimulating place for women to come. And her predecessors were very interested in maintaining ties with the Masonic organizations in town. So, the answer to that question is actually fairly it's personal to the LBM, I would say. And like I began, probably because of my background, I was really interested in reaching out to the pagan community. And I would say I was really interested in outreach. And so one of the coolest things that happened during my tenure was that we performed the Gnostic Mass at a nationwide pagan conference. And it was really well received, and the OTO gained a couple of members from that event. And it spun all of us, so I was just the logistics director for the thing. We had, the local bishops did the performance, but it spun us all up so hard, and it was so inspirational. And we've done other things during my tenure and before. We had the what I believe is the second Women's Symposium nationwide OTO conference there. I think that was in 2016. Very, very successful, incredibly fun. We all learned a lot. And we also had the first EGC conference here in Minnesota a couple of years ago, and also just amazing, amazing events. And I want to say that neither of those events was my idea. Certainly, I was a logistics heavy on the logistics end, and did a lot of the heavy lifting. But someone else came up with the concept. I will say that personally, I'm really proud to have been the author of the closing ritual at the Women's Symposium, the Courtship of Chaos in Babylon. I was very proud of that.
I mean, that sounds like a very, very active and successful tenure. That there was a lot of really interesting stuff that you had go on, and while you note that it's kind of the local body master sort of determines what the particular flavor of things is there. It sounds like, at least at your body, there was sort of a legacy of outreach and of connections to the broader community. It just maybe was different parts of the broader community with each body master, but it seems like there's a healthy recognition of that need for community there. So that's great.
I think so, and it's really people familiar with the OTO will get this and have no questions, but the body master is really just the person who keeps the lights on, and yeah, certainly there's a flavor that's developed from that person, but Leaping Laughter would not be Leaping Laughter without everyone else, and every single person who was associated with Leaping Laughter worked their butts off, gave so much. They're the heart of the thing. I just kept the lights on.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting perspective, and I've been a deputy under 3 different body masters, and which I think is a little unusual, but I think it's given me an interesting perspective on getting to see different types of mastership. And I think 2 of the qualities that have been really successful that I've seen here are things that you kind of touched on there. Body masters who are very open to what the local body wants to do and what the members of the local body have to offer. And then also body masters who recognize that outreach component and realize that it can be a space for the broader community and kind of being a hub to connect different people and not just a singular space for a singular thing. I think from not just what I've seen here and from what I've heard about with you guys, but also from talking with a few other people in other places, it seems like those are really big components of success.
I would say so. I mean, I suppose every LBM has a mantra. My mantra was yes. Anytime anybody asked me if they could do something crazy, I said yes.
I think that works. It empowers the membership. So in terms of different things that a body might do, how do you feel that the OTO affords a space for exploring intersections of modern and traditional magic? In an area like Minneapolis, how can it be a place for magicians and alternative spiritual lifestyle seekers of many stripes to come together?
Well, how is an interesting way to pose that question. I think that does happen at Leaping Laughter. There is huge interest in being part of the broader community. There's a recognition there that while the OTO presence in Minneapolis is special because we have a rented building, we have permanent space. Most pagan community, most smaller pagan communities here in Minneapolis don't have that. And perhaps the fact that we do have that space and we rent it out, we have art shows, we use the space to create community is part of how it works. But again, it's the people, the members of Leaping Laughter want to have community. They go out and they write rituals, they have classes, they help with hospitality suites, they clean the temple. And it's the combination of wanting to have a place in the broader community and the fact that they're so damn energetic that makes all that happen.
Well, that sounds really wonderful, and sounds very familiar. So I think that that sounds like it's a really nice place to be. So shifting gears a little bit, personally, I don't know a lot about your experience with your Holy Guardian Angel. We've had a few conversations that we've shared in, and you've indicated some really great insights on the subject. I've been told by a few people that your experience in gaining knowledge and conversation was deeply beautiful. And in perusing your blog, there was a comment that stood out to me as really wonderful, where you said in the blog, "Every morning I anoint and bless myself with abramelin oil. Bless me, an animate creature of God. I lay in the machine and perform the middle pillar exercise. I feel a presence at times that may be some of the first inklings of knowledge and conversation. My daily meditations have become sharp and easy, my pranayama practice the same. My body has been scourged with many whips, but I remain. Be thou blessed." This was such a beautiful and powerful ending to that blog post, and one which seems so very fitting for how you communicate things. Could you tell us a little bit more about the experience and the process, and about how this medical trial played into the process of spiritual initiation for you?
Oh, that's a big question. Before I launch into that, I want to say that I have been playing is probably the wrong word, but let's use it anyway. But playing with getting to know my Holy Guardian Angel since I was a fairy practitioner. And my first inklings of my HGA, whom at the time looked a lot like Dr. Manhattan. He was super big and he was blue. We should talk over a beer sometime about what that might mean. But so I've been kind of playing on and off with that even before I joined the AA or the OTO. But the situation that you described there, the one that I talk about in my blog, has to do with the fact that shortly after we moved to Minneapolis, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And not for the faint of heart, trying to get through this. It wasn't a big tumor. I was really lucky. They cut it out, and I got radiation therapy. And the piece that you read there has to do with me laying in the machine, delivering solar particles basically to a place on my chest that had been drawn with laser light prior to the thing. Every day I got redder and redder, and my skin blistered, and I got really tired, and it was pretty miserable. And when I anointed myself, I was in the parking lot of the treatment facility, and I would lay in the machine and meditate while I was being irradiated. And I would say I've probably been pretty deeply changed by my experience with cancer. It went on. I didn't actually have more symptoms or more tumors, but because I never really got a clean diagnostic after that, I had full mastectomy maybe 3 weeks after I was ordained a priestess, and I now am absolutely flat. And I think I want to stop there. I mean, no one gets to go through something like that and be an unchanged person.
Mm-hmm. That's very understandable. That's a difficult thing to talk about. And I just think it's very fascinating that going through something so intense and so difficult, that there was still an element of you that was able to touch onto something beyond just the experience like that, and just speaks to your strength as a person.
I think it speaks less to my strength as a person and more to my interest in using almost anything that happens to me as a lever to reach deity, however that looks at the moment. And at the moment, that really did feel like my holy guardian angel. And it was about a week after that I received a name.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very fruitful period in my development.
That's pretty amazing. Now, with having developed that relationship, and I assume that the relationship deepened over time since then, I know a lot of people always talk about the impact of experience with the Holy Guardian Angel as it relates to conjuration and as it relates to the ability to command and call spirits or make spirits do things. But no one really ever talks about it from the perspective of scrying. It's something that I've been experimenting with a little bit along the lines of the earlier sort of comments about having rituals to bless the scryer. A lot of that for me has been based on the idea of connecting the scryer with the angel, so the angel can illuminate the scrying and illuminate the experience. How have you found that, having had this experience of your holy guardian angel and having that deep connection with your holy guardian angel, and it sounds like that's been there since before the scrying work, that there was some connection with the angel, but as that connection has deepened, have you seen an impact in your scrying ability or your scrying approach?
Well, certainly my scrying approach has changed. The results have changed as well, but I'm not certain that they can be solely ascribed to the change in my relationship with the angel. I did mention before that we almost always use the modified Trithemian script to do the conjure, and there is a piece in there that explicitly invokes the practitioner's HGA. So the HGA is present in that ritual at all times. Make straight the way between us, I believe is the phrase. So the angel is present in the setup where we're doing the summoning. So that's always been there. But I will say my techniques have evolved, my ability to be comfortable in these situations has evolved. Instead of saying that, oh, it's the influence of my HGA that has done that, I would say that there's a feedback loop where the more adept I become as a practitioner of magic in general, the easier it is for me to talk to my HGA. And the better I know my HGA, then the more comfortable all of this stuff is in practice.
Makes a lot of sense. And I think that's interesting that that element of calling upon the angel has always been there as part of the system. Do you find that you also incorporate your angel into any of the preparatory work you do, like when you're doing the ritual bath or anything like that, or do you feel like the call in the ritual itself is enough for you there?
In general, I would say the latter, although I have been experimenting with using the headless rite in the bathtub or prior to the ritual bath. And that feels, and of course it feels like HGA stuff to me because I started out with Samic. So that may be a bit of contamination on my part, but that often feels like HGA invitation. Not always, but most often.
I definitely use it that way, even with being aware of other historical uses for it. I feel it's very effective for that. Earlier, you mentioned the OTO's Women's Symposium, which, as I understand, you were instrumental in, and you were also part of the Magical Women's Symposium in London. In addition to having been involved with these two events for women in the magical community, you also work in a field that's generally dominated by men. The OTO and occultism in general would be places that we may often think of as being spaces that could create equality, but a lot of times they still struggle with this. What do you think we can bring to the table by encouraging more diverse voices in magic? And how can we bring more women forward to share and teach and express their experiences and views on the occult?
Also, this is such a fun question because I'm going to answer this in the same way I would answer it if you asked me about the scientific community. So what do we get if we include more people? Well, we get better magic, right? It doesn't matter who the extra people are, just for the moment. When we include more people, we have the opportunity for different viewpoints, different education, different levels of innovation, which is maybe people don't talk about that in terms of the magical community, but innovation is the way to move forward. And if you can get twice the number of people to do this stuff, the results will be better. If there are different people than are currently involved, then levels of innovation and education will be different and additive. And as I frequently say to the men I work with, and mostly they're men, as you said, we're hurting ourselves when we don't admit people of color, when we don't encourage enthusiastic participation of women. It's a statistical argument.
I'm really glad that you started off with that you're going to answer this the same way that you would answer it in a scientific context, because when preparing that question, I thought that was such an element of what makes you such a good person to answer it. Like, not just the fact that you've had a background with working with creating those spaces and working in those spaces in the occult that have helped bring more of a diversity of voices, but that not just in occultism, but also in your professional career, you deal with an environment that isn't just one that deals with that issue, because so much of our society deals with that issue, but one that's been highlighted over and over again by society as an area where we desperately need to fix and deal with that issue. And I think the occult, while not an area that most of society is going to think about, or an area that people think is going to drive or develop society, although it could be an area that could be a big help for a lot of society, is another area that has so many rich voices that we just don't ever invite to speak. And that's not necessarily just women, but women are a big part of that.
Well, so you've answered your own second question there. So, how do we encourage other voices? And this is the same way I would answer this question in my professional community. If you want to hear the other voices, you have to listen to them. And I would say, kind of further that's sort of hard to do when you're the contingent of the male engineers who really honestly think that they're welcoming women and people of color, when they're actually very effectively shutting people down and excluding them.
And I've seen that in the occult community too, where people kind of talk about efforts to be inviting and efforts to be welcoming, but the very efforts they're creating and the very way they're talking about those efforts end up being off-putting to the people that they're saying they want to invite.
I should rush to say that I myself feel pretty included in both communities, but I think, I'm not a spring chicken anymore, and I am less deterred by the way things are, I suppose, than some other folks. And I would say to the men who want to open community, there are ways to do that, and listening is important. And also to the folks who want to penetrate those communities, it's probably dangerous for me to use that word, but there you have it. You need to develop a thick skin and not worry too much. Pretend the other people are not being insulting on purpose. Maybe. I think in general we all want to get along, and it's just old habits die hard. I really feel quite respected by both of my communities, and I'm speaking up largely so that other people can have that experience.
And I think that's really helpful, having the experienced voice there to kind of show people that it's possible, and also to give people an idea of how both to be more welcoming and how to be able to break into the area where people need to learn to be welcome. So I also think it's really interesting that listening is the thing that you highlight, since that's been so much the theme of so much that we've talked about, that it plays in here too.
Broken record.
Well, it's a good song. So that gets us through most of the topics that I had slated to talk about. So I guess the one big thing, and you've announced something big since after I originally put together these questions. So I'd definitely like for you to talk about that as we go through this. But how can people find out more about what you're up to? And are there any major projects on the horizon or goals that you're looking to accomplish that people should be on the lookout for?
Well, of course. I guess if people are interested in my personal adventures, there's my blog. I haven't been super active with the blog, I think, kind of since cancer knocked me out of the habits I had at that point. It's called Adyton Apithia, and it's a blog spot. Go there and comment, and maybe I'll be inspired to be a more frequent writer there. But I suppose the biggest news that I've got is that I've been accepted as a teacher by the Blackthorne School, and I will indeed be teaching a scrying workshop starting here in a couple of days. And if people are interested in that, please go to the beautiful website at the Blackthorne School and have a look. There's a lot of other really nice offerings there, and I am just overcome with pride to be accepted into that community.
Yeah, everything that I've seen as far as stuff they're offering, it's always stuff by people who have such great reputations, and always stuff that looks so promising and so amazing. And when I saw that you were going to be doing a course there, immediately my thought was there are so many people that need this, because this is one of the things that comes up frequently, that people don't know how to augment their ability with scrying, how to develop their ability with scrying, and that it's one of the things that makes it difficult for people when they're first trying to explore spirit work, because they don't know how to interact with the spirit or tell that the spirit's there. And I think for some of us who've done it for a while, it becomes kind of a thing that we just assume. Like, I had a friend once who came to a ritual conjuration, and he hadn't really done any magic, but he was interested in trying it out and exploring it. And it didn't even occur to me to explain to him what scrying was, let alone how to do it. And we do this Trithemian uh, crystal scrying conjuration, and afterwards, everyone was sharing about their experiences, and he's just kind of like, well, I didn't know what to do once you were done the conjurations. So, and I frequently get people reaching out to me who are like, well, I've done these rituals from your book, and I don't know how to scry, so I'm getting some success with the ritual, but I still can't see a spirit. And so now I have a place to point them for something to check out. So that's really good.
Lovely. The more the merrier.
So, do you have anything else that you're planning to have come out, or anything else that you're looking to work on in the future that people should be excited for?
Well, like a thing that we haven't spoken about is that I'm the interviewer for the U.S. Grand Lodge OTO podcast, and I'm continuing that work. And I love to interview people. It's really strange to be on the other side, and I want to congratulate you on your interviewing style. It's stellar. And if people like my voice, I don't. But if you in the listening audience, if you like it, go to Thelema now and listen to me talk to some really exciting people. I'm really proud of that work and would like people to know it's out there.
You do a great job there, and you've had some really, really interesting guests with really, really interesting interviews. So people should definitely check that out. And as far as the being on the other side of things, this is going to be an interesting week or so for me, because I have a handful of people that I have booked to do interviews where I'm interviewing them for In the Company of Stars, but then I also am booked on a handful of podcasts over the next couple of weeks as a guest. So I'm going to be jumping back and forth. In fact, later tonight, I'm going to be interviewed on another podcast. So I will get that same experience.
The universe is keeping you out of trouble, BJ.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Harper. And I'm really glad we got to do this interview. I think we talked about a lot of really great stuff that's going to be really beneficial for a lot of people to listen to.
No, thank you, BJ. It's been an honor.
Well, that's it for episode 4. Hopefully it left you with a new hope for future episodes being awesome. Thank you so much for being here to listen. Harper was the first person to interview me after Living Spirits came out, so it was cool to get the opportunity to interview her. I hope you all enjoyed the interview as much as I did. Our music is, as always, the very public domain recording of the Vorspiel from Wagner's Parsifal, performed at the Bayreuth Music Festival in 1927. In the Company of Stars is available through Anchor.fm, and hopefully is starting to show up on your favorite podcast outlets. We are also available through Stitcher Radio and YouTube. Please subscribe, like, and share. We are at Ep418 on Twitter. The YouTube channel is the Ep418 channel. And you can follow us through the In the Company of Stars Facebook page. For our exciting announcements for today, we are releasing a new book, Luminarium, a Grimoire of Cunning Conjuration, which is an accelerated approach to preparing for a magically empowered and augmented method of spirit conjuration. It'll be out soon, and we hope that you will enjoy it. We're also working on expanded distribution outlets and options for Living Spirits, and we are preparing special subscriber content to launch in June for our Ko-Fi page. Watch the Glory of the Stars blog and our Facebook pages for more details on these announcements coming soon. Thank you so much for listening.